So I have a bit of a problem that I haven't encountered before. And that problem is, when do you repaint a model? I don't know that I know the answer to that. And I think before today, I've always leaned towards never. You just never repaint a model because, you know, it shows where you've been. It's extra work for very little gain. It just, the value proposition in the past hasn't been there for me. That is until today. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about repainting models. When you do it, why you should do it. Is it a good idea? I don't know, but I'm gonna do it anyway. So, right here, this massive wall of orkiness, this is the reason I've decided it's time to repaint some models, and specifically these models right here. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, that's terrain, that's not a model. Yeah, okay, you're technically right. It's a hunk of plastic, though, that I've painted, and although I don't actually play Warhammer 40k, I do sit my models on it as you know, when I'm displaying stuff. And you know, initially when I painted these, it was part of an experiment. It was the first it was the first terrain I had ever painted, and I wanted to make it orky. But as I started going through that, as I got closer to finishing, I thought, you know what? There's just a lot going on, and while, you know, it's an orc construction, it's supposed to have a lot going on. It's supposed to be kind of bright and colorful, and I just don't like the way they look. I approached this with two different techniques, with the idea of, you know, kind of threading the needle between minimalism and still giving it an orky flair. And quite frankly, I think I failed. And when I finished, I knew I had failed, but I thought, doesn't matter. It's done. You're never going to see them again except for when your model's sitting on them. But then something happened. What happened was this happened. If you've seen some of my more recent videos, and I don't blame you if you haven't, because I haven't been posting a lot of videos, that's kind of the problem. I've been in this rut with Warhammer 40k, and to try to get myself out of this rut, I thought, let's tackle some of this low-hanging fruit. Let's get some quick wins in our system, and that'll help us kind of power through and kind of rekindle the magic, if you will. And so, yeah, I recently finished one of these projects, and it worked exactly as I thought, at least so far. And so I thought, you know what, I've had this thing in my pile of shame. It's been there for months, closer to years. When did Octarius come out? I've had this since then, and I wasn't even embarrassed about it. It was just sitting there. I thought, eventually I'll get to it. It won't even have to be on camera. So, you know, I finished painting this, trying again to thread that needle between minimalism and orkiness, but I went way more towards the minimalism. And I really like the way it turned out. I mean, there's still a little bit of color, but they're muted. To me, it looks like it's a big behemoth metal structure, and there was clumsily stuff painted on it, as well as some original stuff, but I highlighted only very specific colors. The rest of it just is supposed to blend into the background, and I'm really happy with the way that this looks. Much happier than this god-awful thing. And still better than this less god-awful thing. But, man, I didn't even want to look at these. They look really gross. And so that's what I thought. Should I repaint it? So my thought process was this. I really like the results of this. I really hate the results of this. And I really enjoyed this, and it was quick. If I do it right, if I do the same thing I did there with these, This will be fun, and it'll be quick too, and then I'll have a uniform looking bunch of structures that I'll be less likely to avoid looking at because they look gross. So, yeah, I'm going to repaint these. For the first time ever, I'm repainting a Warhammer model. The value proposition is finally in the right direction. It's time. And before I forget, welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I am George. Let's repaint some stuff. Hello and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I am George. Today I'm going to take some old, ratty, nasty terrain pieces and repaint them in a manner that I accidentally discovered I really liked. I'm going to keep this one pretty simple because it's not that complicated. The very first thing I'm going to do is break them apart and scrub them clean with some dish soap and a toothbrush. Run them under the sink. Yeah, I'm not doing this over my sink because you don't need to see my dishes and I don't want to show them to you. They're gross. So yeah, give them a good scrubbing because you want a really clean surface to paint on. Particularly for me, I have a small apartment, I have a dog that loves to shed, and there's a couple of other reasons, but let's just say there's a lot of dust and gunk that settles over time on your models, and I think that would give the primer kind of a rough time sticking. I don't want that excuse in my brain. I want to make sure that I start with a clean slate, so scrub a dub until they're nice and sparkly clean. Or as clean as orc construction ever gets, really. Yeah, as I was saying, rude. The next step you want to take is after your model is clean, and once your terrain pieces are clean, is to give them a good dry, because just like dirt may cause a problem with adhering the primer to your surface, water would probably not be very good either. So spend some time with your favorite blow dryer and make sure they're nice and dry before you take them outside for a prime. Okay, my Orky buildings are clean, they are dry, and they're ready for a prime. Did that rhyme? Ooh, how about that one? Okay, that one didn't. For this, I'm not going to use my favorite flat black primer. I'm going to use my other flat black primer, and I'm using this guy, well, A, because I don't like it as much as this guy, and well, I've already bought it, so I might as well use it for something that I don't really care about that much. But also, this guy is textured. It has, I guess, some sand in it to make it look a little bit more like rolled steel. You know how rolled steel has like little grains coming out of it. I'm not sure how that works. I don't know why it looks that way, but it is the way it is. The problem with this, guys, I've used it in the past, and it's very subtle. So subtle, in fact, that you almost never see it. So it's basically a slightly more expensive flat black primer that's taking up room on my supply chest. So this is a good time to get rid of it. All right, my parts are primed. There's no going back now. Doesn't matter what was under here before. It's a clean slate, baby. So that's what it looks like with this texture primer. You can kind of see in some places there's a little bit of graininess. That is by design. I think if you can see it, it's going to add a little something to the look and feel of this piece of terrain. Now, I considered hitting this with a bit of paint stripper, but I don't really care if the details don't show up, that they're not as sharp. It could make a little bit of a difference, but it's not going to be a lot. And at the end of the day, this is an Orky building, so, crude and roughshod is the order of the day. So, the next step is to start some dry brushing. Dry brushing is a technique that I've been using a lot more lately because it gives you really nice looking results, particularly if you want to maximize the contrast between your shadows and your highlights. But probably the best reason to use dry brushing, particularly for large models, is that it's quick. It can cover large areas really quickly with very little effort, and the investment of skill and time into the resulting output, it's crazy. Yeah, it's one of those high value add techniques, especially for large pieces of terrain like this. You don't want to be building up a base coat. You don't want to do any glazing. You don't want to do any blending. You don't want to do any of that stuff. You want to get it done. You want to make it look pretty good, but you don't want to spend a ton of time and, quite frankly, a ton of paint to get this done. This will eat a lot of your paints. For something like this, I go with metallics because it's a big metal building and the whole thing is going to look like metal. Now, because you're going to use a lot, I go with metallic paints. You know, I have one of these sets, and there's always those paints that you don't use a lot of. It's a great time to use this. I don't use shining silver a lot, so I'm going to use that for this dry brushing pass. I'll load up my texture palette with a generous amount of this paint because you're going to use a lot of it. Now, I don't want my model to be actually bright silver, but I don't want to use my gunmetal because that's a color that I use quite frequently, and I don't want to keep buying this stuff. So I add a couple of drops of black, matte black, into that shining silver. Boop, boop, boop. Give it a nice mixing. It doesn't have to be completely mixed because your dry brushing will take care of almost all of that stuff. Bring out your dry brush, get it a little damp. I learned this from Artist Opus, by the way. Love those guys. They're super talented, super skilled, and maybe one day I'll find a legitimate excuse to spend a ton of money on those beautiful dry brushes they have. Until now, I'm using this cosmetics brush. It's fine. Now that all that prep is out of the way, we can focus on putting paint to model. Now, I won't spend a ton of time describing the dry brushing process. There are plenty of videos out there that do a much better job than I can do to explain how to get really good results from your dry brush. In fact, those are the same videos that I've watched, and I highly recommend you check them out. So, applying the skills I've learned from other people and dumbing them down for myself. There's just a couple of rules of thumb that I follow, and that is to be kind of generous with loading your brush, and also be pretty thorough and drying them off on your texture palette. If you don't have a texture palette like this one, there's a video, I think it's by Lila Mev, where she talks about creating your own, and that's probably something I will end up doing here sometime soon. But you can do this a number of ways. Just make sure that it isn't too dry because you don't want a powdery surface as a result of your dry brushing. So, using little circles, kind of make sure you get into a bunch of those cracks and crevices while still leaving plenty of shadows behind. So for the two vertical surfaces on each of these terrain pieces, I'm using this darkened shining silver metallic paint as my dry brush coat over this whole thing, and I'm doing both the interior and the exterior. For the top part, I did something very similar but slightly different. Because I wanted to add another little splash of color, a little bit of variety to kind of break up the monolithic dark shining silver, I went with, instead of shining silver, I went with a darkened copper bronze color. The idea there is the vertical surfaces are meant to keep people out, so those are the strongest kinds of metallic surfaces. It's a shiny dark steel or an iron, whatever that is, but the top isn't made of that kind of metal. It's made of a softer metal, and bronze is softer than steel or even iron. I think I'm no metallurgist, but I think that's how it works. And so it just gives me an excuse to use a different color to kind of break up the monotony, to give it a little bit of extra something while still using a very simple approach. So, prepared myself some copper, darkened it up, and applied it in the dry brush, and applied it with a dry brush, much the same as I did for the vertical surfaces, only this is just for the horizontal surfaces, both the interior and the exterior. Here it is, our new orc building, and it looks not half bad. You'll notice the difference between the top and the bottom. The idea here was to convey the sense that the front and the sides, these were made with some kind of iron or steel, some kind of very tough metal. Up here, they spent less time, or they were less concerned with strength, so they went with, like, I don't know, like a bronze, copper, or some similar cheaper kind of metal, less hard, less rigid. And so you have basically two tones, but in the same style. You can see how this is essentially, it looks black. It reads as black, but it also reads as shiny black, which is kind of what we are going for here. So we can say that we've been successful. Now, if we compare this building with this building that originally inspired me to do this in the first place, you can see it's basically the same. The specifics are different, right? I mean, because the buildings are different. They have different little, gribblies on the walls. But the idea is the same. There's uneven patchiness of this reflective metallic paint, and the patterns are repeated kind of inside. And if you wanted to, you could be done. This is a piece of terrain. It's basically as detailed as anything you've ever painted, because the dry brush does an excellent job of picking out details. And if you wanted to be done, you can be. But I think the selective application of color to this building is a well worth it kind of endeavor. It's going to add something to the model, and if you do it right, it's going to look like it's part of this overall grim, dark build. Ooh, grim dark. Yes, grim dark building. So that is going to be the very next step. But before we do that, I'm going to just let it set overnight, because I've been kind of rushing through this, using a blow dryer to kind of heat or kind of dry the paint and the primer. And to be honest, it's feeling a little tacky. So I'm going to let it rest overnight, come back to this tomorrow, and we should be good to go. It's the next day, and I gave this project plenty of time to dry at its own pace, and it's still kind of tacky. I don't like it, but we're going to get to painting. And there's not a whole lot of painting to be done. That's kind of the whole point of this project, is that you want to stay somewhere in between the minimalist and the orc brutalism, kind of with a bias closer to the minimalism, because the less minimalist you go, the more you have to paint, and the more chances for the colors to clash or for something to not look good. So you want to keep it selective, and you want to keep it subtle. For me, I just picked really two colors. One is red, because orcs is red. I mean, they're not, but come on, you need red in an orc building. And so I used the red to pick out, there's the occasional orc symbol on the buildings, and there's some little fangs kind of towards the top. And I could have gone with, like, say, the red orc symbol and maybe yellow fangs, because, I hear orcs are all about the yellow teeths. But I decided, no, I'm going to keep it red, just to keep the number of colors involved down, and just to kind of manage some of the multicolored chaos. I wanted to be fairly, I don't want to say uniform, but I wanted to be biased towards the minimalist. The less stuff I add, the better off I think I will feel. Now, to lay this down in this project for me, I did something slightly different. Normally when I'm painting a color like red or green or whatever over black prime, I want it to be vibrant, I want it to be bright, I want it to look like red, I want it to be its own thing. And so I usually undercoat with a couple of layers, a couple of thin layers of matte white. And so with a white undercoat, in between the base coat of black and the red, or whatever color you're going to pick, it gives it a chance for the red to stand out on its own. That's not what I want for this project. I wanted the kind of the undercoat, that metallic kind of sheen, that darkness, the swirls of silver to kind of come through. So I skipped the undercoating in white and just went with kind of successive, really thin layers of my red paint. And so I went with thin successive layers because I want it to be kind of translucent, without using kind of an ink-based or like a transparent paint. I still want it to be acrylic, but I want control over how much of the base coat shows through the red. So the idea is I wanted to keep it kind of translucent, kind of transparent. So I went with thin. And with thin, you also kind of have a bit more control, so it doesn't kind of seep into the other areas. Yeah, and the results are different. They're probably not appropriate for other kinds of model painting, but I think for terrain, for large pieces, and particularly for Orky terrain, it's not a bad way to go. I picked out a few pieces, and the model itself has like a mishmash of parts, and these parts, they feel to me like they're scavenged from other places, from maybe Imperial Guard buildings or tanks or other equipment. And so, I decided to go with green. So I applied green for just a few select parts. Those parts that look like they're kind of equipment that were scavenged from other places. And it was very selective about this too. There's a plenty of stuff here that's scavenged or that looks scavenged, and so you could go nuts. And if you want to, you can. You could bias yourself towards more color rather than less. It's a personal preference. It just depends on what you want. For me, I wanted less color, but I wanted meaningful color where there was some. So I picked a couple of the big braces, I picked a couple of vents, and basically every surface on the model should have at least one bit of each of the colors. So sometimes I had to stretch a little bit. I painted things green that I wouldn't necessarily otherwise paint green, but I wanted to have just a splash of color on every surface, including the interior stuff. Now, the last bit of color that I added to this was yellow. Specifically, I wanted yellow lights. There's a couple of light effects on these buildings. Maybe some light bulbs, there's a lot of dials, there's lamps. There's not a ton of them, but there's enough that you could decide not to pick them out. And that's fine. I don't know, but I wanted the lights to show up. So what I did there, it wasn't very hard, it's just a little kind of meticulous, is for this, I did undercoat in white. When I do lights, light sources, since I don't have an airbrush, I'm not going to do, object source lighting, but I wanted to somehow show that these are lights as opposed to a painted surface. So I did add a kind of a base coat or an undercoat of white, but it's a very thin white. And again, this also, I let it kind of build up in just a few thin layers. And the idea here is to get kind of an uneven distribution of the white pigment, so that the subsequent yellow that goes on there, it'll shine differently in different parts. And so like, if the white kind of accumulates more densely around the circumference of the dial, like the inner circumference of the dial or the corners of the lamp or what have you, then when you do end up adding the yellow afterwards, the yellow is more pronounced in those areas, and it's darker kind of where that white pigment didn't show up. It's something that you should play with if you haven't. If you want an easy way of picking out stuff on your models that say, hey, look, this is light, that's one of the ways to go. That's how I do it. It isn't the best thing in the world, but it's quick, it's fairly reliable, and it doesn't take a tremendous amount of skill. To finish things off, I just applied a thin coat of matte varnish to make sure my parts are protected for abuse at the hands of the orc inhabitants of these buildings. And boom, here we are, quick and dirty, but I think it looks pretty good. Now, I only painted two of these. I only repainted two of these. One of these was the original kind of painted model, and it's kind of hard to tell at a glance which one is which. Now, I know which one it is because I wanted to make sure that I could remember, and it's this guy up top. And I know because the one up top had the string of light bulbs, like so, and none of the ones I repainted in this project, none of those had those light bulbs. So these are the new ones. This is the old one. And I gotta say, they look pretty similar and they look equally pretty good. There's some variations, and that's fine. Like you can see, this guy, the original one, had a lot more like the bronze color up top than this one. But there's still that sheen. You can still kind of tell it's the same approach, and they look fairly similar. Here's the other new one, and you kind of see the same impact, but it's still got that shiny, it still has that dark, oppressive orkiness, without the cartoony nature of the other ones, and it still has a splash of color in just those select spots to draw the eye. I gotta tell you, I'm pretty stoked about these. In pretty much no time at all, I have a couple of terrain pieces that I'm not embarrassed to show anyone. Now, repainting models is not something that I would normally recommend on most occasions. It's a matter of personal preference. For me, it's not something that I normally do, but something like this, there's a high value proposition. In my mind, the value is the output, the quality, the happiness, the joy of the output, in reference to the amount of effort or expense that you put into getting that. And this project was fairly low effort. It didn't take me very long. I didn't spend a ton of paints to get this done, and the result is much better than what I originally had. So all around, at least up here, it seems like a no-brainer. Now, I did have a little bit of a concern repainting this, and it has a relatively easy solution. But as I was putting these together, right, because I painted them in three pieces, as you kind of put these together, there's some joints where everything kind of fits, and it's fairly low tolerance. I mean, you can kind of see the gaps there. And those gaps aren't supposed to be there. Now, it's an Orky building, so I don't really care that much, and it's still firm enough, it's sturdy enough that you can put models on here, you can transport them, you can, whatever. It's fine, but it doesn't click into place the way the model originally was meant to click into place. And that kind of bothers me a little bit, but not enough to fix it. And if this happens to you, because in this case, it's primed, it's painted, and then it's clear coated, and then it's reprimed and repainted and clear coated again. So there's a number of layers of paint, and each layer of paint isn't very big, but the tolerances on these structures they're fairly tight. And so there's paint all up in these joints. So if you want to fix it, if you want to get the fit better, you can just go in with a Q-tip and some nail polish remover, some acetone, and go over those joints, the places where the model fits together, and wipe away that softened paint, and you should have a better fitting structure. So I had a really good time tackling this project. I'm really proud of my new structure. Man, I wish there was a way to somehow glue these together in a meaningful way and to have this big old mega structure. for your models to hide in and live in. Maybe that's for a different project. Probably not. But I am curious to know, what is your threshold? When do you decide it's time to repaint your models? Is it a decision you ever take? Is it a decision you're thinking about? I'm curious to know. What do you guys think about it? Hit me up in the comments and let's have a conversation about it. I'm sure our opinions will be very, very different. But the great news is that there's no wrong answers. It's just a matter of opinion, so, let's have a chat. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.